Hallo.
Hello, everyone joining. We're going to give a little bit of time for more folks to get on the call. So just hold tight before we get started. Okay, I'm going to do about 30 more seconds and then we'll get started. All right, I'll start us off then. Hello and welcome everyone to the first workshop of the Canadian Electric School Bus Alliance on making an effective case for school bus electrification. My name is Nicole Roach. I'm Sustainable Transportation Manager at Green Communities Canada, and I'll be your co-host for this event alongside my colleague Valerie Tremblay. CESBA is a joint initiative of Green Communities Canada and Équiterre, made possible with the financial support of the Trottier family, ECHO, and Consacon foundations. I'll begin with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge the many treaty and traditional territories of Indigenous nations throughout Canada. We are grateful for the continued work of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, who are the original caretakers of the land and waters. In our work, we have a responsibility to respect Indigenous perspectives and elevate Indigenous voices. And I'm joining the call today from the traditional land of the Anishinaabe people, situated on Lake Simcoe Treaty 16 territory. And on the agenda today, first, we have a quick presentation by Équiterre, who will introduce CESBA, our theme for this workshop, and our panelists. This will be followed by a series of presentations by leading experts on school transport electrification, starting with a presentation of the health benefits by the CPCHE and the OPHA. Then we have Pembina Institute, who will be presenting on the economics of electric school buses, drawing upon a case in British Columbia. And next up is a presentation by the US-based AESB on their advocacy experience for ESBs in the US. So if you have any questions or comments during the panelist presentations, there will be a discussion session facilitated by Équiterre following the presentations. We have set aside time for questions for the panelists, but also for a discussion on what we can apply from the US experience to the Canadian context. So during the discussion period, you may use the raise hand button or ask your question in the chat. And there will be a 5-minute break following this, which will come at around 3:15 p.m. And when we get back from the break, we'll dive into our workshop activity on how to tailor advocacy messaging to specific decision makers. Participants will be divided into 3 breakout rooms, each corresponding to a level of decision makers to brainstorm ESB advocacy strategies, drawing upon the experience of the US and the information we have available on the benefits of electric school buses. Please also note that the workshop is being recorded and that the recording will be made available upon request after the event. So I will now pass it over to Valerie, a Sustainable Mobility Advisor at Équiterre and co-coordinator of CESBA, to introduce today's workshop.
Thank you, Nicole, for this introduction. So before we dive into the subject of today's workshop, I would like to take just a few minutes to introduce briefly the Canadian Electric School Bus Alliance. also known as CESBA, for those of you who are joining us for the first time today. CESBA was launched in April 2022 by Green Communities Canada and Équiterre with the mission to share knowledge and work with all stakeholders who would like to advocate for Canada-wide measurable policies frameworks that would accelerate the transition to ESB across the country. So as of today, we aim that by 2040, the entire Canadian fleet of 50,000 school buses will become zero emission. So that's in about 17 years. And the feasibility of this target, as well as the necessary means to achieve it, will be the subject of a research report that will come out later in 2023. So far, our work has mostly focused on supporting stakeholders who wish to advance school bus electrification and also to promote the sharing of knowledge. So we have done that through events like this one, but also with our online resource library. And another one of our goals is, of course, to develop strategies and recommendations to accelerate the adoption across Canada, but more specifically in the most populated provinces and region. So Ontario, Quebec, BC, and Atlantic Canada. And so ultimately, we wish to be a public voice in favor of ESB. So we can do that thanks to our 34 members and our network of partners. So before I turn it over to our panelists, I just want to share with you some highlights about school bus electrification and transportation in Canada and how it's been going so far. So according to a 2020 report from Transport Canada, there's over 50,000 school buses across the country that are conveying almost 2.2 million children daily, which means 792 million trips annually. And as you can see from the graph, most of these trips are being done by buses that are still powered by fossil fuel, more specifically diesel. And that's despite the effort of some provinces like Quebec and BC. So this ultimately results in the consumption of more than 500 million liters of diesel consumed every year, as well as several air pollutants that are linked to health problems, specifically within children. And economically speaking, that would mean millions of dollars in health costs and crude oil imports annually across the country. So to talk more about the benefits of switching to an all-electric school bus fleet, we are first joined by Erica Phipps, who's the Executive Director for the Canadian Children's Health and Environment, also pronounced as KIPCHI. So she has over 25 years of experience in environmental health issues and a PhD in health promotion. And she will be co-facilitating the discussion on health benefits alongside Ellen Doyle, who's a board member of the Ontario Public Health Association, but also of KIPCHI and the Windfall Ecology Center. And she brings also 35 years and over of experience in the field of environmental public health. So welcome, Ellen, and welcome, Erica. And we are pleased to also welcome Sarah McBain, transportation analyst at the Pembina Institute, who will be speaking more about the economics of the school bus electrification. And Sarah holds a master's degree in resource and environmental management, and she specializes in sustainable transport policy, more specifically in the heavy-duty transportation sector. And so we thought it would be interesting to learn more about the experience of the United States, who's a leader in the electrification of school transportation. So we wanted to learn about their successes and challenges for the Canadian context. So which is why we invited Karina Chacon, who's the coalition manager for the US-based Alliance for Electric School Buses. She brings a decade of experience in community outreach and organizing and communication strategy to the table. So welcome, Karina and Sarah. And finally, my colleague from Équiterre, Andréane Brazo, policy analyst and CESBA co-coordinator, will join us to facilitate a discussion around the presentation of our panelists. She holds a master's degree in applied political studies and has extensive experience in communication, public policy, and advocacy. So thank you to our panelists. And now I would like to turn it over to Erica and Ellen for a quick presentation on the health benefits.
Thanks so much, Valerie. We're delighted to be here today and happy to see the group of you on the call today. I'd just like to start by acknowledging that our work takes place on the Indigenous traditional territories from coast to coast to coast across Turtle Island as organizations and individuals working to advance children's environmental health. We have deep respect and gratitude for Indigenous people's stewardship of these lands since time immemorial. And we are committed to listening, learning, and working to decolonize our collective efforts towards the goal of healthy and sustainable environments for all children. So I'll start out with a few words about Kipchi, and in particular, an upcoming opportunity within our work that I think represents a great possibility for synergy with CESBA and the regional efforts. And then I'll hand it over to my colleague who will provide a summary of the scientific evidence, both on the health risks for children of diesel emissions, as well as the health benefits of climate action. Next slide, please. So Kipchi, the Canadian Partnership for Children's Health and Environment, pronounced Kipchi, is a national collaboration of organizations with overlapping missions that have been working together for more than 2 decades to improve children's environmental health in Canada. Our aim is to increase awareness and catalyze action to ensure that all children in Canada have healthy environments in which to live, learn, play, and grow. Next. Among Kipchi's 19 partner and affiliate organizations, we have those with diverse experience and expertise in clinical and public health, environmental protection, law and policy, disability advocacy, childcare, education, and health equity. Next, please. So one of Kipchi's flagship initiatives is Healthy Environments for Learning Day. It was formerly known as Healthy Schools Day. We took over leadership of Healthy Environments for Learning Day in 2017 and renamed it to be more inclusive of all learning environments, including childcare. So each year we convene a broad array of interested organizations and sectors to co-create a campaign that culminates in early April. And as you can see from the list of campaigns that have rolled out so far, a couple of relevance to the work that we're talking about today. Most notably in 2019, we had a campaign about diesel school bus emissions where we were mobilizing knowledge, research from Health Canada and other near-term ways to reduce kids' exposure to diesel, while also calling for the shift to electric transportation for schools. We've also in 2022, 2020 and 2021 engaged with youth leadership and youth voices on climate action. And then I think really exciting for our conversations today, and we look forward to your thoughts as we shape the upcoming campaign, which we will focus on electrification of school buses across Canada. So obviously an opportunity to leverage the regional work that's ongoing as well as the work of the Alliance. And it also builds on the work in Ontario led by Pollution Probe, which is a founding Kipchi partner, and including the white paper that Kipchi co-authored with Pollution Probe and the Delphi group. Next slide, please. Oh, there seems to be one slide missing. So maybe just, oh no, actually there isn't a slide missing, I'm sorry about that. But I did just want to say a few things before handing it over to Helen, which is that children's environmental health is obviously a key driver for this move away from diesel towards electrification. But I think we all recognize that for today's kids in particular, coming out of a pandemic and with the threat of global climate change, we are also facing eco-anxiety and mental health concerns. So when we think about the health benefits, and Helen will get into this more, we're thinking about not just the physical risks, but also the mental health risks and the symbolic move that a shift to diesel can be for kids. Right now, our reality is we're asking kids every day, millions of kids, to get on a bus that they know is part of the problem, right? So we're really excited to be working collaboratively towards that vision when kids get to go to school on part of the solution. And so that iconic yellow school bus is an act of hope. It's an act of active hope, and it's also a way to bring climate action in a very tangible way into communities across Canada. So we're really excited about that. Really happy to be part of this alliance and this collaboration. And again, look forward to your thoughts about how we can shape our campaign to amplify the work that you're doing. And without further ado, I'll hand it over to Helen, who will provide some of the evidence on children's health benefits and risks. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Erica. All right, so the emissions from diesel school buses are no different and equally harmful than emissions from any diesel fuel motor. Heavy duty trucks, diesel equipment, diesel generators, they consist of a complex mixture of solids, liquids, and gases. They're hazardous to human health. Some examples here: fine particulate matter, nitrogen dioxide, carbon monoxide, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, VOCs, and ground level ozone. And when inhaled, the image on the left shows a little graphic of this, these toxic chemicals can travel throughout the body, resulting in various systemic health effects beyond respiratory effects that we all think of. And I'll describe some of these in a later slide. Next slide, please. So air pollution and health scientists have described the very small particles in diesel exhaust as Trojan horses because, well, they can cause harm on their own. So example, lung inflammation. They carry other toxic diesel compounds on their surfaces, allowing them access to organs, fluids, and cells throughout the body. Next slide. So while everyone is at risk from air pollution health impacts, children are at greater risk because of their susceptibility physiologically, their developing bodies, brains, and lungs, and their greater exposure, their breathing rate, their activity levels, their outdoors, being closer to the ground where vehicle emissions are concentrated. And some children are at even greater risk due to inequities that contribute to both susceptibility and exposure. Next slide. So the health effects of diesel exhaust have been studied extensively. These are the most common and the most studied health effects of diesel exhaust. And the conclusion of Health Canada's risk assessment of diesel exhaust, they conducted a risk assessment in 2016. Their conclusion: diesel exhaust is a human carcinogen. It causes respiratory inflammation such as asthma, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, reduces lung capacity, and it's linked to several other respiratory effects, cardiovascular effects such as heart disease, arrhythmia, and stroke, cancer, including lung and bladder cancer in adults, and childhood leukemia, central nervous system effects, including neurological degenerative diseases such as Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, immunological effects such as increased sensitivity to allergens, pollen and mold, for example, and reproductive and developmental effects, including autism. Next slide. So these numbers here are staggering, but they only tell part of the story. Health Canada conducted an assessment on diesel, as I mentioned, emissions in 2016, and they only looked at diesel exhaust, but they looked at the impacts of only 3 pollutants: fine particulate matter, nitrogen dioxide, and ozone. And they estimated that those 3 pollutants alone contribute to hundreds of premature deaths from diesel every year, over 2 million acute respiratory symptom days, 170,000 asthma symptom days, and 3,000 child acute bronchitis episodes. And earlier this year, Health Canada published an assessment that looked at the health impacts of traffic-related air pollution, so both diesel and gasoline emissions. And once again, it's only those 3 pollutants I mentioned. So 1,200 premature deaths, 2.7 million acute respiratory symptoms days, 210,000 asthma symptom days, and 3,600 child acute bronchitis episodes. So from these 2 sets of data, you can see that the diesel emissions is the greater contributor to these health impacts. Next slide. So exposure to diesel exhaust is both an equity and environmental justice issue. Children from marginalized communities are exposed to traffic-related air pollution both at home and at school. Health Canada identified that lower socioeconomic status neighborhoods are often located closer to high traffic corridors, and thus traffic pollution. And they've also estimated the number of schools that are within close proximity to traffic corridors. So 48% of schools across Canada are within 200 meters of a high traffic roadway and 31% within 100 meters, thus showing that children are exposed throughout the day at school, but also at home. Next slide. So I focused so far on air pollution, diesel exhaust, and child health, but the climate change and child health linkage is extremely important to recognize, as Erica had mentioned earlier. Children's physical and mental health in Canada is being impacted now by climate change, from air pollution that is worsened by climate change, whether it's wildfires, pollen, or vehicle pollution, from extreme heat and other climate diseases, vector-borne diseases, and climate anxiety. And diesel school buses contribute to climate change. One diesel school bus emits around 82 metric tons of carbon dioxide over its 12-year lifespan, and that's equivalent to the greenhouse gas emissions from 23 passenger vehicles over the same time frame. Next slide. So Health Canada has estimated that by the year 2050, climate change will result in many more deaths from air pollution alone. So they did some modeling and they identified, I already presented some of the data on health impacts of air pollution today, but we expect to see those numbers increase, 850 more deaths every year because of climate change or air pollution related to climate change, millions more acute respiratory symptom days, child acute bronchitis episodes, and asthma symptom days. Next slide. So as with air pollution health impacts, children are at greater risk of a myriad of climate-related health impacts, including extreme heat. Their bodies have more difficulty regulating temperature, water and foodborne diseases. Once again, their immune systems are still developing. Food insecurity, which Health Canada has estimated food insecurity increase, and that's associated with poorer general health in children. Children are also more sensitive to climate-sensitive diseases such as Lyme's disease. Mental health impacts that Erica also mentioned, post-traumatic stress after disasters, the impact of being displaced or evacuated because of extreme weather events, the climate anxiety, and also very importantly, the feelings of betrayal and moral injury because of the future that lays before them because of climate change, and also the health inequities. There are health inequities that are experienced now, but those are going to be worsened because of climate change. And there will be new conditions created across the country as new inequities emerge. Next slide. So while it's our final slide that summarizes the benefits, we hope in describing the health benefits, the health impacts of diesel exhaust and diesel school buses, that the benefits of replacing them with electric school buses is clear. Not only will it improve local air quality, one study in the States identified that a 30% reduction in childhood bronchitis and asthma cases resulted from a substantial reduction in school bus diesel emissions, but we'll also see reduced greenhouse gas emissions. And Health Canada, again, has modeled the air quality benefits we could see of one climate mitigation or greenhouse gas reduction scenario. So it can prevent thousands of premature deaths, millions of acute respiratory symptoms days, thousands of asthma symptoms days, and acute bronchitis episodes every year. And finally, active hope. It's also a way for adults to demonstrate to children and our future generations that we're modeling sustainable and climate-friendly behavior. And we want children to see that they can be part of that solution, and one of those solutions being electric school buses. Thank you. The next slide, I think, has just our contact information and a link to the school bus electrification white paper that was mentioned earlier. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Erica and Helen. We will now pass it over to Sarah from Pembina Institute.
Hi, everyone. Thanks very much for having me here today. So I would like to acknowledge that my work is situated on the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. My name is Sarah McBain, and I am presenting on behalf of Pembina Institute on electrifying school buses, the costs, benefits, and progress in British Columbia. Next slide. So very quickly, just to give a little bit more background, Pembina Institute is a charitable think tank that advocates for strong, effective policies to support Canada's clean energy transition. And we work in several areas, including renewable energy, oil and gas policy, transportation, buildings, energy efficiency, and other various important areas. Next slide, please. But for today, the content that I'll be sharing is primarily drawn from a report prepared for Pembina Institute by Dunsky on the benefits of electric school buses in BC. And so to start, I'd like to give just a little bit more background on the current state of play in BC in terms of the costs of acquiring an electric school bus. So a typical new electric school bus currently costs around $400,000, which compares to roughly $150,000 for a conventional diesel bus. On top of that, operating an electric bus would require the installation of at least a level 2 charger, which may cost between $15,000 and $20,000 for the equipment and installation. And so to help encourage the adoption of electric school buses, the government of BC does provide financial support for the purchase of the buses as well as associated charging infrastructure. So core bus funding is provided by the Ministry of Education and Childcare, which is available for publicly operated buses in public school districts. But there's also a series of additional funding streams specifically for electric school buses. And most notably, so Clean BC provides a subsidy covering 33% of the pre-tax purchase price of an electric school bus. And this funding can go up to around $150,000. Up to $6,000 can be provided to cover the cost of installing a level 2 charger. And then additionally, BC's low carbon fuel standard provides credit revenue for operating vehicle charging sites. So there's a few other funding opportunities that are listed here, as you can see, but when all of this funding is stacked together, the remaining capital that school districts can anticipate to cover can range from about $60,000 to $147,000. And this outstanding capital can potentially be financed through low interest loans from the Canadian Infrastructure Bank or potentially funded by the federal Zero Emission Transit Fund. Next slide, please. So government funding does seek to encourage the adoption of electric school buses out of a growing recognition of their potential to mitigate climate change. But on top of that, there's a range of other economic benefits that stem from adopting electric school buses. So as mentioned, there's a lot of health benefits. So healthcare savings can be substantial. And then on top of that, school transportation operators will see economic benefits in the form of lower maintenance costs as well as reduced fuel costs. So in terms of health cost savings, through reducing nitrogen oxide emissions, one electric school bus over a 12-year lifetime can generate up to $5,500 in health cost savings. An electric school bus also helps reduce sulfur oxide emissions and particulate matter, translating in up to $1,400 and $5,000 in health cost savings. And so together, one electric school bus can actually result in around $11,800 in total health cost savings. There's obviously other health benefits and other emissions that can be reduced as covered previously, so that could end up being even more. Additionally, as I mentioned, school district transportation operators can expect to reap operational benefits. So since electric school buses use electricity in place of diesel fuel, which tends to be more costly, one electric school bus over the course of its lifetime can translate in up to $166,000 in energy cost savings. Electric school buses are also easier to maintain, resulting in lower maintenance costs. So roughly $36,000 can be saved from one electric school bus over the course of its lifetime. And then, as I mentioned previously, BC's low carbon fuel standard can provide credit revenue for school districts that operate EV charging sites. So one electric school bus could generate approximately $100,000 in credit revenue over its lifetime. And so here I'm showing the difference in operating costs between a diesel and electric school bus to really demonstrate the potential economic benefits. So focusing here on the lifetime operating costs. So when you add up energy costs and maintenance costs, operating an electric school bus would cost around $73,000 compared to $275,000 for a diesel bus. And so this amounts to roughly $202,000 in savings. But then on top of that, when you add in credit revenue from BC's low carbon fuel standard, the business case for electric school buses improves even more. So if you were to add in $100,000 in credit revenue, that would take the total operating costs for an electric school bus down to just below $30,000. Next slide. And so the cost savings that I've just talked about, along with funding and credit revenue from BC's low carbon fuel standard, all of these together can be used to pay back some of that initial difference in upfront capital costs between an electric school bus and a diesel bus. And so here I'm showing the total cost of ownership for a Type C electric school bus in BC under different funding scenarios. For reference, around 71% of Canada's school bus fleet is Type C. But here in this graph, we see already that just with core bus funding in BC and then credit revenue from the low carbon fuel standard, a Type C electric school bus would pay back the initial capital difference over a diesel bus in around 10.8 years. But then when you add in the Clean BC subsidy, so the 33% or up to $150,000, that then brings back the relative payback period to about 4.4 years. So already the business case for operating an electric school bus in BC is quite promising. Next slide. We've also found some additional research that's quite interesting. So research by ICF assessing the total cost of ownership for electric school buses in California shows that by 2030, Type A and C electric school buses can be almost cost competitive with diesel buses without any subsidies. So that means without subsidies, without credit revenue from a low carbon fuel standard, these buses might be able to compete on their own with diesel buses in 2030. Next slide. For now, though, funding programs are extremely critical in encouraging the adoption of electric school buses. And to accelerate the shift, several measures can be taken. So first, funding programs in the province can be streamlined to help really reduce the administrative burden of having to navigate all of those multiple funding streams that I reviewed. Secondly, in the short term, the province could potentially increase the subsidy that's offered to cover the full capital cost of an electric school bus. Quite importantly, as I showed in this presentation, low carbon fuel standard credits really help improve the business case for electric school buses. And so it's critical that the province moves forward with plans to distribute and collect these credits. And then lastly, this is very important, is that outreach and education building campaigns should be organized to really help school transportation operators become more aware of funding opportunities, how to navigate them, and on top of that, you know, most generally, how to operate a new electric school bus, how to maybe conduct feasibility assessments for their fleet, install charging infrastructure. All of these things are really critical to push adoption. And so capacity should be built in that sense. Next slide. Sorry, and then next slide after that. So that brings me to the end of this presentation. Thanks very much for listening. And if you do have any questions, I'd be very happy to answer them during the question period. And this slide here just shows the report that I spoke to during this presentation, and you can visit the Pembina website if you want to find out more information about it. So thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Sarah. That was really interesting. next, we will hand it over to Carolina.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here with all of you. And I know that there's a lot that is very unique to the United States, but happy after this is over to take some questions for ways that we can find some similarities. Next slide, please. So want to give a little bit of information about the Alliance for Electric School Buses. We are a diverse coalition of not-for-profit organizations that are committed to an equitable transition of the US school bus fleet to electric models that, as we've discussed, will really clean up the air for US children, which there are 25 million children who ride school buses each day here in the United States, as well as the communities that those buses drive through. Our value proposition is that electric school buses not only protect children's health, but they can also impact their academic performance based on some studies that have shown the impacts of diesel and smog pollution on test scores, as well as school attendance. We also believe that school buses can obviously help us meet our climate goals, but by reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And then if deployed equitably, they can help advance environmental justice by making sure that the communities that have most borne the burden of pollution are the first to benefit from these programs. Our coalition has 34, we have over 24 members that do work in 34 states, as well as at the federal level and at very local levels. Our goal, again, as I've already described, is to really ensure that the transition is prioritizing the school districts that are of the highest need in the most polluted areas, which data tends to show are low-income communities and communities of color. We also think that this transition is a good opportunity to create well-paying careers with family-sustaining benefits for US workers across the manufacturing industries, the deployment industries, maintenance industries, and other places where workers can benefit from a cleaner work environment. Next slide, please. Already described these are some of our members. We're very proud to work with not-for-profit organizations, and many who are led by visions of equity and a community-led futures. And so again, we're just very excited to see similar movements growing across North America. Next slide. One thing that differentiates our coalition, there are a few other coalitions in the United States that are focused on electric school buses. There's one that is industry focused. There are a few that are more regionally focused, but for us, what really makes us different is that we are guided by racial, economic, and social justice principles. And so for us, it's not important just that the transition happen, but that we are really targeting the transition to happen first in the communities that are most suffering from pollution. And so as part of that, you can see that these are some of the principles that we hold. We want to make sure that school districts that serve these communities are the first to receive the benefits of electric school buses. And in some cases, that means targeting funding programs towards them, ensuring that their voices are heard throughout the decision-making process, and really making sure that programs are keeping in mind that many of the school districts that so far have electrified have been affluent or in communities that could afford to pursue grants or to just outright purchase school buses, but that there is an incredible opportunity here to right some wrongs and deliver cleaner air to the communities that have long most deserved it. Next slide, please. Thank you. As part of that, we also want to make sure that communities are centered in this process. Because we work with so many community-based organizations and community-led groups, we want these communities to be at the forefront of decision-making. So we want them to be involved as school boards are making decisions. We want, in many cases, we are organizing communities that are then speaking with school decision makers, school district staff, federal and local decision makers to ensure that they're aware of the need for this transition to happen. And we don't want to lose that voice because this is why we do this important work. Additionally, like I already mentioned, we really believe that there is a possibility to make sure that there is a just transition for workers in the United States, and to open up new opportunities for workers that have historically been excluded from industries such as manufacturing, particularly workers of color, people who've been impacted by the criminal justice system, women, veterans, and others that really deserve a shot at being part of this new clean energy economy that we're building. And one thing that we always note is that The transition also requires trusting workers, but also giving them the tools that they need to ensure that this happens successfully. And that means ensuring that they have the training and the support. Sometimes that comes from dealers, sometimes from manufacturers, but sometimes from a wide array of stakeholders, so that they can actually ensure the success of these buses. Where we've seen struggles in electric school bus pilot programs, we can really trace a lot of that to issues of drivers or mechanics or other technicians or workers not having received the training that they needed, and that either delaying or causing issues with deployment. And so we see workers as a key part of this transition. Next slide, please. Just to share a little bit of context about our coalition, because I think for us, advocacy has looked very differently throughout the years. So I wanted to be able to provide kind of some historical context. Our coalition started really informally in 2017 by CESBA Sierra Club, VEIC, which is actually a nonprofit group that provides technical assistance for clean energy projects, and the Environmental Law and Policy Center, which is regionally based in the Midwest United States, just getting on the phone once a month and sharing intel. A couple of these groups, particularly CESBA, Sierra Club, and ELPC, had seen an opportunity with the Volkswagen settlement to really ensure that funds were going towards electric school buses. And this was only a few years into electric school buses having hit the road in the United States, but we felt that the Volkswagen settlement funding, because it was so much, there was funding both at the federal level and at the state level, and each state was getting millions of dollars, we thought this could be a good opportunity for folks to really begin to invest in pilot programs that would test out electric school buses. So during that time, the coalition was meeting just to share intel amongst each other about what they were hearing, how advocacy efforts were going, best practices, what tactics or strategies to try next. In 2018, we were able to host a briefing for members of Congress talking about electric school buses and our efforts, which were at that point really focused on state governors. And that culminated actually later that year with the National Governors Association meeting, which was happening in Santa Fe, New Mexico. We had a rally and a march to the convention center to draw additional attention, hoping to get governors to listen about the Volkswagen settlement. Most of them had directed their agencies to produce plans, as had been required by law, for how to spend that money, but few of them were considering school buses as part of those plans. And so we really wanted to make sure that funding was going towards not cleaner diesel, not other fossil fuels, but towards a zero emission solution like electric school buses. So as you can see, we have some media coverage from that. And again, that was planned among our coalition members. Then in 2019, the coalition had already started growing, and we were put in contact by then Senator Kamala Harris, who was interested in drafting a bill to fund electric school buses. At that time, it was a Clean School Bus Act, which we helped draft and provide support for. And it would provide up to $1 billion for electric school buses in the country. It was the first bill of its kind at a national level, and it really started drawing attention to the opportunity here to make sure that school districts were interested, but the number one hurdle continued to be that upfront cost of electric school buses. And so providing federal funding would be a solution so that more school districts felt like they were able to do that, as well as coupling that with other funding sources like the Volkswagen settlement funds. Then in 2020, Senator Kamala Harris began running for office and actually brought the issue of electric school buses with her on the campaign trail, which was very exciting to see presidential candidates talk about electric school buses. We were able to mobilize and organize community members in battleground states to start asking about electric school buses as candidates were making campaign stops. And that made it so candidates in many cases had to learn about electric school buses, start speaking about them. One of the other candidates during the Democratic primary, Jay Inslee, who's the governor of Washington, had been one of the few governors to actually meet with us when we hosted the rally in Santa Fe. And he continued talking about electric school buses, pledging to fund them at the national level and to champion them as well as president. So it made it a really exciting time where electric school buses kind of took over the national conversation and were part of many candidate platforms. At that time, our coalition also started acquiring new members. and really just growing into what it would become last year, where we started finally formalizing the coalition. A coalition manager was hired. That's me. We started developing a steering committee, began to develop additional principles and missions and visions, and really formalize a lot of the structure that had so far been fairly informal and democratically led. At that point as well, we were able to work with members of Congress as well as the White House. Vice President Harris continued to be a champion for electric school buses and worked with members of Congress as well as many other stakeholders that at this point were paying attention on the Clean School Bus Act, the Clean Commute for Kids Act, which in particular, the Clean School Bus Act was essentially what was folded into the bipartisan infrastructure law, the IIJA as it's more formally known, which has now provided the EPA Clean School Bus Program, which is a $5 billion program to fund new school buses, both electric, propane, and CNG. But the first $1 billion of those funds that are going out this year, 90% of those applications, we're excited to report, were for electric school buses. So a lot of our work over the years has led to this moment where we have a national program that provides funding. We'll actually fund a pilot program in all 50 states, and a huge chunk of that will also be for electric school buses. So we're very excited to see the progress of all this advocacy. Next slide, please. The work that we do is very advocacy focused. We train community members, parents, caretakers, students, youth to advocate for electric school buses and demonstrate that demand, sometimes at school board meetings, sometimes in meetings with decision makers, sometimes in communication strategies, but we really want to make sure that there is local demand and support for school bus electrification, and that we're engaging the right stakeholders as we do that. Many of our coalition members also have national offices that are able to pair up that local advocacy with advocacy before members of Congress, before key agencies, and also to support state legislation as it happens, which we've had over the last couple of years, much more success at being able to pass those bills that before were maybe lingering a little bit. We also work to help local coalitions as much as possible to ensure that regionally folks are taking control on the ground and helping secure wins that make sense for their communities. And then of course, there's a huge education component of the work that we do, focusing on the benefits of electric school buses in partnership with many other nonprofit organizations such as WRI and many others. So engaging directly with school districts to provide information about those benefits. And an area that we are really diving into now, which is a little bit newer for us, is engaging utilities and public utilities commissions, so utility regulators for us, on supportive regulations. What does that look like? What are some best practices? How can we encourage utilities to really step up and be supportive? Because if they're not ready to support a school district with the infrastructure that's needed, it'll be much harder, if not impossible, for a school bus deployment to get off the ground. So that's some of the work that we're doing right now. Next slide. I think already went through some of this, but again, a lot of our advocacy is before members of Congress, asking for additional funds. Even though we have the Clean School Bus Program, and that's $5 billion, our original request had been for $25 billion, which we believed at that time, if that request had been fulfilled, the White House also proposed their own $20 billion budget for electric school buses. It would have helped catalyze at least the transition of half of the US fleet, which would have been a huge transformation for us. But we know that $5 billion program is great, but we need more. That $5 billion program also funds fossil fuel buses. And so we're looking for other additional opportunities in Congress through appropriations, through new legislation to secure additional funds for electric school buses, some of which the recently passed Inflation Reduction Act will actually incorporate as well. It funds some possibilities for school buses, but school buses would be competing with other heavy duty vehicles. Again, we do a lot of petitions, sign-on letters, briefings, work to really ensure that members of Congress are becoming champions of electric school buses. And we have been developing a policy equity framework that we hope to roll out soon that will kind of include some best practices or recommendations for what we look for in policy to be supportive of that, and also how we can assure we can ensure that we reach our mutual goals. And we've also been sending a lot of letters, having a lot of meetings with the EPA and other offices to ensure that the programs are being implemented in ways that will most help communities that need this transition to happen. Next slide. I think I already went through the majority of this. This is just a quick rundown of things that we've been able to do. There's been some key victories as well in states where some of our partners are located. New York, Maryland, New Jersey, Connecticut, Arizona, Colorado, Nevada, Washington have all passed legislation in the last couple of years, in some cases mandates, to fund electric school bus programs and begin this transition. California, as always, has been leading the charge. They've had programs even longer than the Alliance, in some cases, has been around. So we look to that state a lot for what opportunities can be pursued, what models they're looking at. But California is a state that obviously has done a lot of work on this already. And then obviously just continuing to have widespread community support, which we were able to see with the applications that came in for the Clean School Bus program, which thankfully, again, 90% of those applications were for electric school buses. Next slide, please. To go over some lessons learned, and I know that we're running out of time here soon, just wanted to touch on some of the things that over the years have been key touch points for us of things that we've learned, that we found. Successful messaging really centers on talking about cleaner air and healthier children, being able to point out the damaging effects of diesel, which the amazing presentations ahead of me already did. Being able to talk about how this also helps communities that are looking to reduce pollution, not always necessarily talking about it in terms of climate, but talking about it in terms of the environment and the communities that we want to see and how we want to reduce pollution, which across the board is something folks support. And then we do talk about the potential cost savings for school districts, which again, you already had an amazing presentation on that. Because school districts across the United States are so different in some cases by region, by state, by climate, by a number of different factors, we are making sure that school districts are able to calculate their own cost savings. While we know that thousands of dollars in cost savings are possible, there's always unique scenarios that school districts have that might change just what those numbers look like. And so we encourage school districts to do the math, and we believe that the math is on our side. But we want school districts to be able to see that for themselves. And so some of those tables that y'all had were really incredible and something that we try to model as well. There is a huge learning curve when it comes to electric school buses, which I'm sure most of you already know, but there's many misconceptions about where or how they work. Because there's been such a rapid evolution in what manufacturers have been able to produce in the last few years. School buses, from 5 years ago, are sometimes very different from more recent models. And those models have really improved a lot of things that manufacturers themselves learned as they started doing this. And so because of that, we know that some of the first generation school buses were not necessarily the kinds that folks now have, and some of those earlier lessons are maybe less of a concern. But the industry is rapidly evolving and learning so much as these buses are on the road, which is really great because we are seeing higher quality products that address a lot of previous concerns coming out really quickly. But there's a huge need to educate community members, decision makers, stakeholders, school district staff about the differences of electric school buses and the benefits, because there's still a lot of misconceptions that folks have about that. And so education is probably the number one thing that we do. Next slide. Obviously, funding is the number one concern for any school district that we talk about, even those that are on the road to a sustainability plan or have staff that is already interested in this. They need to know where they're going to get the funding because of the price difference between a diesel bus and an electric one. And so our coalition has really been focused as advocates in making sure that there are funding programs for school districts to take advantage of, both at the federal level and at the local level. Many school districts are willing to take this chance, but they need to figure out where the money is coming from. And so having a clear list of funding programs or being able to clearly explain some of the federal programs is a key priority for us, because if a school district can't see where they might be able to find the funding for this, it's really tough. Few school districts have the dedicated staff and resources to really dig for that on their own. without any outside help. In California, it's been very easy for school districts to do this because of the plethora of programs that they have and enjoy, but in other places, folks may not be aware. Utilities might just be starting their own programs, or there just might be a dearth of opportunities, and opportunities have to be created. We've also learned a lot about the impact of this transition on workers. Like I mentioned earlier, training is critical and something that we know a lot of stakeholders are working on, how to ensure that there's easily accessible training, because OEMs and dealers are not always to provide training to the satisfaction or to meet the needs of school districts. And again, without that, a lot of issues can happen in deployment, but it can also really slow things down and can also impact the cost savings that school districts see. And then obviously we want to make sure that, again, this is a transition for workers that might be moving from manufacturing diesel school buses to electric. What is it? What are the protections that they need to make sure that they still play an important role in this economy, but also just in this transformational shift. And one thing that has been in the last couple of years more poignant is propane propaganda. The propane industry has really focused on school buses as an opportunity for them. In many cases, they understand that there's a more nuanced proposition that they can make about less infrastructure. It's maybe a little bit more familiar to folks. They talk a lot about how you already use propane to cook, for grilling and things like that. And so they've really started to position themselves as green, as clean and affordable. And that messaging has been successful in some cases. And because of that, we are trying to pivot to make sure that we have messaging for school districts. We're able to counter some of the lies that are being said, counter some of the greenwashing, and also provide information on the cost savings, the emissions impact, and other benefits of school buses that propane can't meet. But we see them a little bit more active, even though the demand overwhelmingly is for electric. We see that propane is making some inroads, and that's an area where we're increasingly focusing our attention to be able to counter. Next slide, please. And that's really it. We're very excited that there's a growing movement for this that transcends borders. We know that there's a lot that we can learn from each other, and I know there's so much that I can learn from the work that all of you are doing as well. So I'm really excited to be able to make this connection and to be in partnership with all of you. So thank you for your time today.
Well, thank you very much, Carolyn, and thank you to Erica, Helen, and Sarah for their presentations as well. So that's definitely a lot of very interesting knowledge on electric school buses. As Valérie said earlier, I am Andréane Brazo, policy analyst, and we will start this discussion period by taking the questions from our participants. So we already have a couple of questions in the chat. I guess we have a question from Jamie Young, and the question is, has the USA and Canada considered art contests by students to design bus artwork to explain why fighting climate change and protecting health makes them happy? So has anyone heard of any initiative like that?
I can answer that. We've seen some local art contests, and there have been some that I think manufacturers have hosted. In a similar vein, the propane industry actually sponsored a contest for a student to win a propane school bus for their school. And it was, I think, like a science essay that they had to write. So we've seen industry use some of these tactics, which in some cases can be great, and others, it promotes propane. I will say that Thomas Built Buses has a coloring book for children, which is pretty cool. And I'll be completely honest that the Alliance is going to steal that idea, and we're going to create our own. That's going to be a little bit more community focused. But there certainly have been some art contests that have taken place. But again, I think they've been mostly industry led in our experience.
Thanks for your answer. Feel free, everyone, to open to raise your hand by clicking at the bottom on reaction and raise hand for any questions. We have a couple of comments, so if you guys want to join the conversation, Derek and Alice, feel free to do that, because those were not framed as question. Any reactions from our panelists to the chat?
Yes, Erica?
I just had a question for Carolina. That was a really interesting presentation. And I'm wondering if the recent state legislation, whether it has any antidote to the propane propaganda in the form of perhaps a sunsetting of any fossil fuel school buses at a certain point in the future, or do you have any examples to share of ways that legislation can help make sure that the transformation is fulsome?
Yeah, definitely. What we've seen is that, for example, New York, they're the first state to have a full-on mandate saying that they're going to go all electric by 2035. So that's one way to basically, for them to say, you know what, propane school buses are not welcome here because we're only focusing on electric. We've seen a few other programs that are focused only on electric, and I think that's the best way to do it, is just to say this funding is specific to electric school buses, because for school districts, even though there's much smaller upfront sticker price difference for propane, there's still a cost difference. And so being able to put all of those funding opportunities towards electric is really critical. California, I think similarly, well, not similarly, on the other hand, their programs have funded things like renewable diesel, renewable natural gas, which is like just biogas, and a few other like what they call alternative fuels. And so we see school districts that even those that have championed electric school buses also apply for those funds because they're trying to just diversify their fleets, and they're going for different things to create a mix. So in some of those cases, we are trying to work to make sure that California pivots away from that, but they're also a huge fossil fuel producing state. And so that makes it a little bit tougher. And then I would say that the biggest thing that state legislation right now can do, we've seen programs in Massachusetts and Connecticut that help supplement federal funding. So that's really exciting because many school districts that are applying for the EPA funds, they think the funds are great for purchasing the bus and purchasing the chargers, but not for the rest of the infrastructure upgrades that might be needed to their school bus lot. Whether they need to do trenching or work with the utility to invest in additional infrastructure, they need funding to do that. And so states that are saying, we might not provide necessarily funding for you to buy a new bus, but maybe for infrastructure, that's huge. As well as Massachusetts, I think, is starting a really innovative program where they're going to provide, they're requesting that contractors or consultants bid to help provide technical assistance to school districts. So that's another opportunity where states can say, again, maybe we won't pay for a new school bus, but we'll pay for someone to help you plan out your deployment, your infrastructure, do all of that planning that you might not have the knowledge for to be able to do successfully. And then lastly, I would say that state legislation is critical in getting utilities involved. And this is, I think, an all hands on deck moment. We've seen programs in Maryland and Nevada that have really incentivized utilities to create what we call make ready programs. And so they help install the charging infrastructure and they take on a lot of the costs for that infrastructure. That's really necessary because otherwise school districts, again, just having the funding for the bus and even the charger might not be enough depending on what else the utility says needs to happen. And so having legislation that kind of encourages or incentivizes that is a big opportunity for school districts. And obviously for utilities, at least in the United States, there's an incentive in vehicle to grid. And so being able to use that is an incentive for them to create more grid stability and essentially have backup power. And for school districts, it could be a source of revenue. Most of our V2G pilot programs are in their infancy. But for states that can really make that case for utilities and encourage them to make those investments, it pays off for the school districts.
Thanks for your answer. We still have 1 or 2 minutes for questions about the presentations. There was one comment about how New Brunswick has been pushing for propane instead of electric buses. And so I guess, can you talk a bit about how, if it's still an issue in the US, and how you were able to fight against that kind of greenwashing?
We're still working on it. Honestly, it's still something that I would not say we've declared victory on yet. There's still a lot more work to do on that. There's been a few things. One is the propane industry. They do a lot of marketing. And so working with groups that have the funding to be able to counter some of that marketing in those same spaces. We've seen that the propane industry takes out ads, webinars, booths at many conferences that relate to school transportation, school districts. They sponsor luncheons. So they're using their funding essentially to really like elbow their way into the room. So we're encouraging folks that have that capacity to also do that, to be there and provide kind of like a counter argument to propane. It also requires talking to school districts directly, and sometimes not through advocacy organizations, but sometimes through other trusted messengers, local decision makers, national associations for people transportation, or others, to really be able to show that the direction that the industry is going is towards electric. And so even if they do invest in propane, the likelihood that they're going to have to swap out those buses for electric down the line is still huge. And so why, instead of having stranded assets, right, why not begin that transition now, planning ahead for the future? So there's a lot of messaging that we've prepared to kind of address some of these concerns. We can't obviously be everywhere that the propane industry will be, but we can try to be as many places as possible and make sure that advocates and community members know why propane is a false solution, right? And for a lot of that, for us, that falls back on propane is going to continue worsening the climate crisis. But that's messaging that may not work everywhere, right? That may not work in more conservative areas of the United States where climate change is a very polarized topic. Yeah.
Thank you for that. And again, thanks to all of our panelists for the presentations. We'll be moving on to the questions on the right of the slide, so to group discussion. So of course, Erica, Helen, and Sarah, feel free to join the discussion with Carolina as well. And everyone, if you have any answers to provide to the questions that we put on the slide. I realized that most of the questions on the US experience have been answered by Carolina during her presentation. But I think that the next step is really to ensure that all of this knowledge is put to good use in the upcoming months and years. So I'm opening the floor to a group discussion about what we've learned so far. You can also write it in the chat if you prefer. I guess I'll start with something that I found really interesting. Again, to Carolina, so what you mentioned that you are trying to involve the most vulnerable communities in the decision-making process. And I was wondering if you had any example of how you're doing that, how you're actually doing that in the country, and where and when in the decision-making process are they involved?
Yeah, definitely happy to talk about that. One thing that many of our coalition members do is they organize in local communities. And so they have local volunteers. And for some of these clean school bus campaigns, those volunteers have been trained to interact with school boards. So for us, we have school districts are usually overseen by school boards, and they have regular meetings. And so in some cases, we make sure that community members are part of the school board meetings to either present or support a presenter that's going to talk about the need to transition. And then we want to make sure that we can also turn out community members when the school board is potentially making a decision. Obviously, it's not possible every single time across every single state, but it is something that we encourage folks to do and to aim for, is to make sure that if the school district, in some cases, a school board has to decide, yes, we will apply for this funding, or yes, we will purchase these many buses. That has to be approved sometimes by that school board, that community members are a part of that they provide public comment on which areas of town they'd like to see those buses transition to, so that we make sure that we're covering the areas that have the highest pollution and using community experience for that. We've also done a lot of petitions at community events with community members to educate them about that. And sometimes those petitions get delivered to decision makers. So governors or others and community members are a part of those deliveries. They're a part of meetings to say, I think this is really important to me and I want to see school buses here, here, or here. What we're working on now is figuring out, once school buses have been purchased and they've been deployed, how to continue to ensure community members are a part of the conversation in implementation. And for example, I think right now, a lot of that looks like having community members continue to push for, okay, so we've gotten 1 or 2 buses, let's expand. What is the plan for the rest of the fleet? Is the school district going to create a plan that gets us to 100? And what is needed? What is required to get there? What are the obstacles? Members like Moms Clean Air Force, Mothers Out Front, CESBA, they do a lot of work where it's, in many cases, moms that are meeting then with school board members or decision makers or attending these meetings. And they're the ones speaking up about why they want this, or attending legislative hearings on potential bills and showing their support, and speaking from their own experience about their children that might have asthma, or in areas where, you know, you're suffering extreme heat, like already adding pollution to that is just not great for kids' health, and kids can't then be outside or sometimes have to miss school. So really encouraging those community members to participate as much as possible where there are those kinds of opportunities where they can be heard of directly in front of decision makers. So that's one of the ways that we try to do it. Sometimes it just varies community by community where the best opportunities lie, and we encourage folks to really find local solutions to that.
Thank you for that. Do we have other interventions, either from participants or from panelists?
Perhaps I would have a question for Sarah. You were mentioning all of those wonderful funding opportunities in BC, and I think aside from BC, there's Quebec, who has like a funding program, but still there's not as many opportunities as there is. Do you think those kind of funding programs could be applicable to the other provinces? Do you know what's been the success rate? Like how many applicants for like the number of buses that has been either delivered or at least ordered?
Yeah, so I know that Quebec also has some funding opportunities, which is really great. And I do think that these programs can be replicated across other provinces. Of course, like it's been mentioned, you know, the needs across provinces and the landscape of what electrification of school buses would look like there is quite different across the country. So these programs might need to be tailored in different ways to kind of meet the needs of specific communities or provincial needs. So I think that they can provide a skeleton, or at least a level of ambition to demonstrate their potential. I don't have the number on me in terms of the success rate or the amount that's been funded through the program, and I am happy to provide that in a follow-up. But I do know that it has been successful. Like the Clean BC subsidy program has been used quite a lot. And then on top of that, I think I mentioned, so whether or not provinces do have funding, the federal government does have programs to support school bus electrification. So there's the Zero Emission Transit Fund, and I think Derek mentioned in the chat that that can provide up to $200,000 for a school bus. And then the Canadian Infrastructure Bank also has low interest loans for to help, you know, schools adopt electric school buses. There's some barriers in terms of accessing those loans, because I mean, I know school districts are not really accustomed to taking on debt. So there's some of that work that needs to be done in terms of helping school districts become more familiar with it and helping them navigate this kind of new funding opportunity. But yeah, where there is gaps across provinces, I mean, the federal government has stepped up with some funding support, but it would be great if other provinces could also develop similar programs to BC and Quebec.
Well, thank you for your answer. That's very interesting. Again, thanks a lot to the three of you. And now we'll be taking a short 5-minute break to refresh ourselves before the next part of the workshop, where we'll be divided into groups to better strategize about advocacy work that can be done at different levels of government and policy making. So we'll be back, and well, stay tuned for what's next.
Yeah, we will reconvene at 3:21. See you back then. Okay, is everyone back and feeling refreshed? All right, great. I'm seeing some faces back on here. It's wonderful. We'll just wait for a few more folks to get on before I go over the instructions for the next segment. All right, so welcome back. For the second part of the workshop, we're going to be doing a discussion around tailoring advocacy messaging to decision makers. We are going to be having an open discussion about different levels of decision making with consideration for federal decision makers, so Environment and Climate Change Canada, infrastructure, transportation. Also looking at provincial decision makers such as education and childcare, transportation, environment, and also local and regional decision makers such as school districts and boards, student transportation services, and school bus operators. So we do have a number of questions to guide this discussion, and we also have Jamboards to be able to use to post sticky notes to make this a bit more engaging. So we were initially going to have these as smaller breakout groups, but our numbers have shifted. A few folks had to go to other meetings this afternoon. So we're going to try to do this as a group discussion with all of us. So bear with us as we're shifting things around. Valerie, are you pulling up a Jamboard for us? Great. Okay, will we start with federal? Okay, super. So the set questions we have here are, what are the characteristics and priorities of this decision maker? Which messages and what narrative would they be most interested in? How do you approach messaging to appeal to this decision maker? And what barriers do we expect or currently see with this decision maker? So I think we learned a lot of great information from the presentations today that can hopefully inform some of our ideas around these areas. So maybe let's move to question 1. And this is open, anyone can start speaking. We want to make this as collaborative as possible. So you can put something in the chat, you can speak, and then we'll get a, actually everyone can join the Jamboard and add sticky notes themselves. So be nice if there was some discussion though, as opposed to us just silently adding sticky notes to a board. So if people do want to share some of their thoughts. I see a raised hand. If you raise hand, Benoit, you can go ahead.
Yeah, I think that the federal government is well engaged with the funding. I think we've got a bigger barrier in Ontario with the provincial government and the utilities, the distributors. Because today, I mean, besides not knowing if we're going to get funding or not, there's a program in place to subsidize the purchase of an electric vehicle. But I mean, besides pushing them to fast track the award of those grant would be, I think they're well engaged. It fits well in their message, in their policies, in what they support. So I don't think that's the biggest barrier. But again, others may have a different opinion because I have two operators here that have applied, and they're waiting for answers.
All right, thank you, Erica.
I guess from a health perspective, you know, obviously climate change would be an angle for the federal government given their spoken commitments. But in terms of health, I think the health equity, the focus on communities that are so-called vulnerable communities from a health equity perspective, certainly in the reform of the Canadian Environmental Protection Act and the work of Health Canada, there's a lot of focus on disproportionate health burdens and risks. So I think that might be something to prioritize as well.
Right, I'll start reading out some of what we have here. So for characteristics, it needs to be seen as an election issue and tailored to what their priorities are. Are also many competing interests, ensuring buy-in from industry, and for messages and narrative to demonstrate the financial payoff associated with ESBs, focus on children's health and air pollution. The one's quite small, or maybe it will get bigger. Sarah, you can go ahead.
Yeah, so I'll also add, you know, in terms of messaging, as well as just the priorities, I think this kind of goes towards both as sort of energy security, especially in today's current context, right? So moving towards electrification and having electrification of school buses is a step towards energy security as a country. And I think that that's especially important. And then along with that is ensuring we have competitive supply chains in the country. So, you know, moving towards electrification of school buses plays a role in making sure that we have competitive battery supply chains, you know, helping various industries be a leader in terms of the movement towards clean energy. So, yeah.
Great, and Carolina noted in the chat that competitive supply chains has definitely been an issue in the United States. So that's a really good addition. Helen.
Thanks. So I'll repeat this when we get to the provincial one, but what I think is really important is to engage the Ministry of Health and our Chief Public Health Officer at the federal level, definitely at the provincial level. What I've found when I've looked at mandate levels or mandates of the different ministries at the federal level and provincial level, there's very little discussion about climate change in, I would say none, in the federal mandate letters for the Minister of Health. Well, we wouldn't know what it is at the Ontario level because we haven't seen those mandate letters, but I assume it's the same. But that the health argument, so not just the health impacts, but that health cost argument is so strong that I do think we need that voice. So I think it's not just the Minister of Environment at the federal level we need to engage, but also health.
Definitely. is anyone able to speak to any barriers that they have encountered if trying to engage with the federal government on this, or trying to speak with different ministries? I know in some cases, yes, Adrian, go ahead.
I guess one thing we saw is that there is a new subsidy program for medium and heavy duty vehicles, but I think the majority of school buses are not allowed or are not yet eligible to the subsidy program. And I feel like that's one thing that we should ask and advocate for in the near term for Canada, for sure.
Yeah. Has anyone experienced going to the federal government around issues related to children or education, and then they've been told that it's not really federal jurisdiction, or that's for provinces to deal with? Or has anyone encountered like speaking with a ministry and then they say that's not ours, that's another ministry, and then you're passed around? Some of these issues that affect health, affect the environment, affect a lot of transportation. Sometimes it's really unclear as to who's in charge or who's dealing with these issues. Anything else to add on the federal decision makers Jamboard here?
Well, I guess I'll just add that the federal, the issue with the federal government, in my opinion, or one thing that really confuses me, is how public transit buses and school buses are treated pretty much the same way and through the same programs. And since it's really not the same organizations who go to them, I think that complicates accessibility a lot to all the programs that exist.
Erica.
So, Nicole, in answer to your question about the health angle, I think that's true to a certain extent, and I think it also depends on how it's framed, right? Because I think some folks would some policymakers might look at school bus electrification as a technical issue, as a climate solution issue, and not a health issue. So it depends on how effective we are at turning it into, to a large extent, a children's environmental health issue. So that's one thing. I mean, I do think that the Minister of Health should see a mandate for this because of the links to climate change, but also, inside Health Canada, they're doing a lot of very relevant work related to diesel, related to proximity of schools to major roadways, traffic related air pollution. There is a lot that comes very, very close to this work. So connecting those dots for that ministry in particular, I think would be valuable.
Okay, super. Are folks okay if we move on to the provinces? And I think I'll keep it fairly open. If anyone wants to speak to any of these questions, then you have the floor.
I guess oops, sorry. I see that Helen has her hand raised.
Thanks. I just said I was going to mention this when we got to the provincial one. I think some of the earlier notes when we looked at provincial decision makers, it was Ministry of Transportation, Ministry of Environment. But again, I think at the provincial level, since they do have a strong mandate for health, that has to be one of the provincial decision makers that we do need to target. And I thought, Sarah, your presentation about British Columbia, like those numbers are so compelling. That is a strong argument for taking immediate action to address the health costs of, say, diesel buses, of air pollution. So I think for those of us that work in public health or children's health, that's just maybe a push for us to do some more of that advocacy for those particular ministries and the bureaucrats and staff in those ministries.
Just to add to what Helen just that there's a near-term health cost implication, right, in terms of the asthma suffering and so forth. So as hospitals are being swamped by COVID and, you know, their respiratory effects as well, maybe that's an angle. Again, depending on what province you're talking about, I think there are certain provinces where kids' health is probably not the thing they care most about.
Yeah, very, very good. Andrienne?
I just put it on a post-it note. So one thing that's interesting in Quebec is that while there is a really strong desire to be a leader in the electrification of school buses, we see that their programs are not well designed for the current realities that we see, which is that a lot of school board operators are unable at the moment to make the transition, while the government legally requires the purchase of new school buses to be electric. So we kind of have an issue of transitioning in Quebec, and I think that that's something that could be a key learning for other provinces for sure.
Would you mind telling me, how does that requirement work in Quebec? Did it come in from the provincial government, and is it on the sale of new school buses or on the purchase?
On the purchase. Basically last year, in 2020, the government adopted the target to have 65% of all school buses on the roads to be electric. And for that, he said, starting in 2021, we will have no sale of diesel buses. And it's actually, it's been put into law, but we see that a lot of school bus operators just don't comply with the regulation because it's not feasible for them.
Great, that's really helpful. Thank you.
Great, and Sarah, I'm very interested in the economic framing for especially conservative provincial governments. So, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean, the economic framing, it plays a huge part, and I should clarify, you know, in my presentation, I was speaking on what the health cost savings would be for over the lifetime of one bus, but imagine like an entire fleet. So like those health cost savings can really add up beyond the numbers that I spoke to. So that's when you get to those kinds of numbers, they can be very powerful in terms of messaging. And I think what's brought up in terms of the Quebec thing is and the issues with that kind of program, and there's a huge gap in terms of capacity. Like that's a barrier that I see being really large, is getting directly connected to the people adopting these buses and making sure that they have support and understand how they can, you know, conduct feasibility assessments for their fleets and understand how to charge their fleets and everything that goes into it. It's such a new behavior. So without that, it's obviously a very hard thing to transition to. So I think that's a huge barrier for provinces, is developing effective programs to be able to provide that.
Great. Is there anything else for discussion for the provincial decision makers?
Funding in Ontario is challenging because all school bus operators are private company, for profit, that contracts through the school boards with a consortia. And the upfront cost is a challenge. So again, the uncertainty about funding, long-term funding, is also a challenge because it's a huge commitment from an operator. And you know as well as I do that the government, the current government is not necessarily engaged in the most active way in climate change. So it's going to be a challenge. And I don't know how we change that. But I think approaching the healthcare side, the health of the young children is certainly the way to entice people to talk about it and promote the idea of going to clean energy. But at the same time, Ontario is not as limits in the capacity to produce electricity, and the local utilities, when we look at charging 150 bus in one location, it's certainly a challenge for the local utility to provide power for that.
One thing I'll note, so I put this in the chat, and this is, I guess, more of a political consideration, but what we found in the United States is that obviously there are big transitions between between governors, essentially. So after elections, there is usually a really great opportunity if you see a Democrat being elected that might be more interested in championing electric school buses. Like one example that comes to mind, and this wasn't necessarily an election, so it can happen anytime these transitions take place, but you all might have heard that in New York, the governor there had to resign after some pretty heinous allegations came to light. And the governor that took over, Governor Hochul, decided to make electric school buses one of her key priorities. And so surprised advocates by saying in the State of the State address that she was going to commit the state to make this transition 100%. And that was a transition that happened very quickly and folks were able to capitalize on because someone new came into power and that person was more interested than the previous person. We've also seen it conversely where a Democratic governor, because usually it shakes out this way, though maybe it's different in Canada, but a more progressive governor leaves and a more conservative one hops on, and they maybe walk back previous commitments or funding, or they replace key agency folks that might have been supportive, and that can also produce a change. So sometimes keeping elections in mind is an opportunity to accelerate or decelerate change is important. And in some cases, those happen more often, or there's bigger sea changes than at the national level, although you can't say that for the United States now. Every presidential election is a gamble. But yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. And I see a raised hand from Donald.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, I'm in Calgary, but I'm working on a project on electric school bus with Pembina Institute. I'm with Green Economy Canada, and we're focused on the economic aspects. And I think the perspective that we've got, and that I think is probably quite valuable, and particularly in Ontario, has a long history of being integrated in the auto manufacturing supply chain. And this provincial government in Ontario is very focused on economics, taking advantage of leverage on business advantages. And in the automotive industry, obviously have a long-standing history, but also real strong potential in lots of startups that are working in really interesting battery storage opportunities. And Ontario is probably unique relatively in also having pretty significant sources of some of those really important source elements and minerals that can also be valuable in Canada generally. So I think that's probably one of the best ways to approach this with the Ontario government, is appealing to their strong desire for economic growth, economic diversification, and particularly in the energy transition. If Ontario gets the right support in place from the provincial government, and the federal government is usually prepared to step on board as well, there's a good argument to be made that electric school bus, electrification of transportation generally, but in particular the electric school bus industry is going to benefit and create a bunch of jobs, and it's going to change the way the economy looks somewhat, but could be a real opportunity. And we're already seeing that with Lion in Quebec. It has strong supply chain connections into Ontario. And I'm not sure the provincial government is completely aware of those, but it kind of demonstrates the potential. So Lion at this point is being forced to put in a manufacturing facility in the States, in Illinois, because of the Buy America approach. And the provincial or some of their suppliers in Ontario can slip in and still supply that much larger factory that's being probably up and running in the next few months in the States, compared to the size of, it's about 1/10 the size of their production, and Quebec is about the 1/10 of the size of what will be built in Quebec. So I think that's a good approach as well, and it has lots of legs in big parts of Canada.
Great, really, really helpful perspective there. And Sarah, we'll finish off the provincial section with you.
Yeah, I think what Donald said is really on point in terms of talking about not just the role that electrification of school buses plays like on its own, but just in terms of a broader transition to electrification of all vehicles. And so where some provinces do have, targets in mind in terms of what they'd like new sales to be for electric vehicles in the future. I think one thing that's really powerful is, California has developed this framework where they've identified school buses as being one of the first applications for electrification, where if proven successful there, really helps grow the market and transition other vehicle types. So it's kind of a first application and a point where we can really also just prioritize, our efforts at first, but then that grows out to help provinces actually reach their sales targets and overall climate ambitions later on.
Great. Well, I think that does it for provincial decision makers. So we only have a minute or so to talk about this. So if anyone has like really burning contributions that they want to make, then I'd love to hear them for regional and local decision makers here.
I'll just mention real quickly, I think the number one thing we found for local folks, especially like school boards, is budgets. They're very concerned about their budget. So the economics are particularly critical at a local level.
Okay. I've been informed we have a couple more minutes, so rush everyone if they have something they want to contribute. Yes, Donald, please.
Thanks. I love that little hand symbol. I think that at the local level, the budget is absolutely primary. They need to make financial sense. They don't have any considerations almost outside of that, except they may make commitments to the health of their students. They may make commitments to being good citizens within their budgetary constraints. And so at the local level, activists can have a significant impact in helping frame the priorities of a school board, because there's nothing probably more effective than having maybe a room full of people who are saying, you need to do this for my kids. I don't want them breathing in these fumes anymore. And I've heard that the business case is good, and we need to do this. And it almost doesn't matter if the business case is good because it's about our kids. So I don't know that that's an easy solution, but I do think there's a lot of parents out there who are starting to think about this. and maybe a small number who are actively engaged, but that if they saw it come up at a meeting and there was some way to for them to provide input, there might be greater engagement potential than you might think is easy to get people out for something like that. So I think local engagement in the local school boards can be quite a powerful tool.
I have maybe a question for Ellen and Erica. I was wondering, from your experience, would you say that health-focused messages are more successful with school boards and school actors than environmental messages would be? And just thinking from the image, I think Ellen also mentioned in her presentation that children are more affected by diesel exhaust because they're closer to the ground. They're almost at the same level as the exhaust pipe. I would see that as a strong message, especially since I know diesel is mostly harmful for the health more than so for like GHG emission. So I don't know what your experience has been with that. Is that something they were mostly interested, or was that maybe that message a bit too strong and not as friendly?
I mean, I think that the health message is always strong. And the previous speaker that sort of, my kids shouldn't be breathing these fumes, that's very, I think, very basic. Everyone can kind of get around that. But thinking about what Carolina was saying earlier, it probably depends on the community, right? So some communities would be pro climate action and sustainable transportation in the community, and there'd be a lot of support, and school bus would be, it would make sense in that context. Whereas I think in other communities where there's a heavy burden of air pollution or something, just the inhalation risk and the effects on developing lungs and developing brains of that exposure to diesel throughout the day, and the diesel school bus just being on top of that background exposure, that would be probably stronger than or sort of environmental sustainability big picture argument. So it's probably community by community almost. But I do think, I mean, throughout working on children's health, like kids' health is always for politicians, for families, it's always a high motivator.
If I could add to Erica's point, so when I worked at the local public health unit level, are like the local medical officers of health that kind of help you support the budgets you need in your own public health programs for advocating for positive public health behavior. I had a difficult time trying to advocate that we need to address air pollution and the impacts to children's health, but there was lots of support from the local medical officer of health about active transportation and active safe routes to school. But I think, so that's goes back 5 to 10 years. But I think now with some of the Health Canada and stuff that's been presented today, we've got so much more evidence about the impacts of air pollution on children's health. I mean, we used the same argument 5 or 10 years ago, but I feel we got more data to back that message up. So, well, yes, we're all behind active and safe routes to school for children's physical activity and mental health benefits. At the same time, I think we've got a much stronger argument for reducing emissions from all vehicles, including school buses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, active transportation is definitely complementary to what we're doing here, and it's all part of a bigger puzzle. Great. We'll finish out with Andrienne and Benoit. So Andrienne, go ahead.
Oh, it was an old hand, but I'll leave it to Benoit.
Okay.
Just to shed some lights on the organization of school boards in Ontario. Although trustees are elected official, trustees do not have any impact on funding. They cannot change tax rate. It's set by the province, and the funding is set by the province on a per student basis. So although the local authority, the local school boards are very interested in the public, in the health of their student. The bigger challenge is balancing the budget. So going and spending more money on an electric school bus without funding coming for it, it means that money needs to come out of the classroom, and there's no money to come out of the classroom because 85% of the budget is salaries. So we have an archaic system that evolved in some direction that trustees are still given power, but they have no power to raise money. So it's a challenging environment for sure. So I'm not sure that we just need to consider that when we, because even presenting that's what I do, advocate for the safety of the student, and the safety includes air quality, and we make choice here. But to go and convince operator, we don't have the money to go and convince the operator to spend twice the money because we don't have a cap and trade model like in BC where you can recoup money from using clean energy. It's far more challenging from that perspective. Just want to clarify that Ontario is a different environment in some ways than other provinces.
Yeah. Okay, I see a hand up from Craig. So Craig, if you can go quickly.
Sure, just really quick. I mean, just totally, absolutely correct what Benoit was saying. The boards have no real control over this from a money standpoint. The funding is what it is, and it's never enough. So it'd be hard at the local level to convince the boards to pay the huge increase in cost of busing, school bus contracts, to absorb those costs of electric school buses. However, I mean, if the funding and the incentives and the financing and where it comes available from the federal and provincial levels, certainly on the local level, school boards could look at longer contracts in order to be able to pay off the cost of those more expensive vehicles. Traditionally, the contracts are usually 5 to 7 years in Ontario, so maybe we need to look at 10 to 12-year contracts, and that's very much in the hands of the local school boards.
Good, very good addition. All right, thank you everyone for this really productive discussion. I think some really fantastic ideas came out of that. Thank you everyone for contributing. So I'll hand it over to Valerie for closing remarks to finish us up.
All right, thank you. I was switching around the tabs, yeah, so that basically concludes our first workshop on making an effective case for school bus electrification. We've mentioned a few resources throughout the presentation. So we always have our CESBA resource library that you can find on CESBA website, so eschoolbusalliance.ca. And on there, you can find the white paper report on school bus electrification in Ontario from Pollution Probe, Delphi, and Kipshi that was mentioned. There's also the report on the electric school bus adoption in BC from Pembina and Dunsky. And also to mention that the Alliance for Electric School Buses also have a webinar coming up on November 3rd that's co-hosted with the World Resource Institute on electric school buses business model. So that's very interesting. And you can register for it on the WRI website under events. And so as for us, you can always keep in touch throughout our newsletter. So we use it to send you updates on our work, news on ESBs. So it's on a bi-monthly notice. So be sure to write to us if you want to be added to the list, and mark our communication as non-spam to make sure that you receive it. And so the next one will also serve to give you a bit of a summary of what has been exchanged during the workshop, and also to give you more details on the next CESBA members meeting, which will be around December. And so before we leave, we just wanted to invite you to complete the survey that's in the chat here. So it's going to serve to better prepare for a next workshop that's going to come up in the winter of 2023. So we have a bit of question regarding content, the future events. So don't hesitate to reach out to us if you have any comments. The workshop are really to facilitate discussion, promote knowledge sharing. So we're always welcome to improvement. And so before we leave, I just wanted to congratulate and thanks our guest panelists, Sarah, Ellen, Erica, and Carolina, and as well Adrienne, for taking the time to come and sharing their knowledge and expertise on school bus electrification and therefore contributing to their advancement. So unless there's any question, I would say thank you and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, Valerie.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.